Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 10 of our course on brain and behavior. This week is going to be covering the topic of what causes emotional and motivated behavior. So let's go ahead and get into it. In this chapter that we're going to be covering over the course of this week, we're going to be talking about trying to identify the causes of behavior. We'll talk a little bit about the neuroanatomy of motivated behavior. We'll discuss the role of chemical senses in motivated behavior, the control of regulatory behavior, sexual differences and sexual behavior, the neural control of emotion, and reward. So let's begin with identifying the causes of behavior. So there's a couple aspects to this. One of those is going to be emotions. When we're talking about emotions, think things like anger, fear, sadness, jealousy, embarrassment, and joy. Those are some of the cornerstone emotions. And then, of course, there are all of the smaller distinctions within those two, right? Like maybe disappointed or a little bit afraid or versus horrified, things along those lines. Happy, peaceful, rather than joyful, all of that. With all of these, emotions are not always things that we are immediately aware of. And a little example of this is for me, when I haven't eaten for a day or so, I can really quickly become very, very irritable. And people who are close to me, they might recognize that it takes very little for me to get frustrated at little things that are going on around me. And when they see that, they might suggest that I eat something. And in the meantime, I might not even recognize that I'm feeling irritable or hungry in that case. The feeling of anger or frustration that I'm displaying is not always consciously aware to me, and that's something that we often find with some of these emotions. We're also going to be talking about motivation. I think this is too often overlooked, and I think it's really a cornerstone of understanding human psychology. Motivation, we're going to be talking about behavior that seems purposeful and goal directed. This too is something that we're not always consciously aware of, but it is goal directed nevertheless. And I think it's so important in the context of human behavior for a number of reasons. So we're thinking about another example. Why am I more likely to order a salad rather than a pizza when I'm eating in a restaurant with others, maybe coworkers? But when I'm home alone late at night, even though I have the stuff to make a salad, why might I order pizza delivery and have that at home? And thinking about some of these. And when I lay out that kind of example as clearly as I do there, it's pretty, I think, obvious what some of those motivations may be. But so much of the behavior that exists in the world, it takes place, and it's not always quite as easy to notice. And then we're also going to be going over some of the neuroanatomy of emotion and motivation. Some of the key systems are going to include the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the frontal lobes. So we'll get into that a bit as well, I think, particularly in the following lecture. So we're talking about one of the research focuses, the pain of rejection. Are physically painful and emotionally hurtful feelings manifested in the same neural region? What we found is that the loss evokes painful feelings, and the loss or absence of contact that comes with social rejection leads to some hurt feelings. So, in other words, that's just to say that social rejection can hurt in much of the same way that physical pain hurts. So, when we're talking about this as pain, it truly is neurologically pain. The same systems are being activated in many senses, and so even though different systems may mediate these two experiences, there's also a difference in the phenomenological or the phenomenology of the two pains. So we can re-experience or relive these feelings of social pain even when the painful episode has long passed. Whereas, especially with some of the physical pain sensations, they're not so easily relived. You might think back to when you were learning to ride a bike and you fell off and scraped your knee. You can imagine that had happened and that it hurt, but the actual extent of that pain isn't maybe as harsh as if you think about a time that a close friend had hurt you in some way or said something. And if you think back to that instance, that can still be a tender feeling that will arise as you think back on it. Now, Ethan Cross and colleagues, they had researched the neuroanatomical basis of physical and social pain, and they found two regions in particular that respond to both types of pain. These are the insula and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. What these researchers found and concluded was that the social and physical pain overlap in the brain, but like I said, they're mediated in some of these different systems, which are then relived differently. So when we're reliving the social pain, that activates the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, whereas reliving the physical pain activates the somatosensory cortex. And the social rejection, that also activates the default network, which extends far beyond the anterior cingulate and insular areas. Another insight from this body of evidence is that normalizing the activity of these brain regions probably provides a basis for both physical and mental restorative processes. So seeing the similarity in brain activation during social and physical pain helps us to understand why social support can reduce physical pain, the same way that it soothes some of the emotional pain. Now let's talk about identifying some of the causes of behavior, the behavior for brain maintenance. So Robert Butler and Harry Harlow, they did some research using rhesus monkeys that were placed in a dim room with a small door that could be opened to view in an adjoining room. They spent a lot of time opening the door and viewing whatever was in display in that other room. And the researchers found that these monkeys, they were willing to perform various tasks even to look through the window. The longer that they were deprived of a chance to look through that window, the more time they spent looking when they were finally given an opportunity. So what this is showing us is that the brain will seek opportunities when there is no stimulation present. Our brain really desires stimulation. And here's a picture that's displaying that study a little bit. The image on the left, you can see that the monkey is peering through that small window, and there's this train going by. Whereas the image on the right, the monkey is looking at a bowl of fruit. And the train, this is more stimulating as an image to look at. It's something that's moving, it's going around. So the monkeys really enjoyed looking at the train, and they would spend more time watching the train versus the bowl of fruit. Because even though there may be some colors that are interesting and there might be some appeal to fruit to the monkey, it just isn't not quite as much stimulation. Now, the brain circuits that are associated with the reward sensation can modulate to increase or decrease activity. This is related to the androgen levels and sexual interest in males, and the chemical senses and motivated and emotional behavior as well. Understanding the neural basis for motivated behavior has a lot of applications, and the main reason for a particular thought, feeling, or action lies in what is happening in the brain circuits. So as we're thinking about this and we're understanding it neurologically, one of those examples that was given here with the androgen levels and sexual interest in males, researchers who are studying some of this phenomena with the rewarding properties of sexual activity in males, they found that a man's frequency of copulation correlates with his level of androgens. Now, the androgens, those are the hormones that are related to some of the traditionally masculine characteristics that society will think of. And so the individuals with unusually high androgen levels, they were related to this ultra high sexual interest, whereas abnormally low androgen levels, those were linked to a lower sexual interest and perhaps no interest in sexual activity whatsoever. And the brain circuits are more difficult to then activate in the absence of some of the androgen that's there as well. And this, I think, is really a good example in understanding some of the brain circuits that are related to some of these specific behaviors that exist in the world, and trying to understand that a bit more as well. Especially, I think, in the context of some of the motivated behaviors. So then why are there some of these brain circuits that can uh, exist to help us understand behavior? And one of the explanations from this, from an evolutionary perspective, is the concept of this innate releasing mechanism, or the IRMs. These are a hypothetical mechanism that's used to detect specific sensory stimuli and direct an organism to take a particular action. These activators of newborn adaptive responses then aid an animal's survival. So, as the name implies, since it's innate, these mechanisms are present from birth. They're genetically passed on from parents to children, and it ends up creating these specific types of behaviors that can just exist naturally that we see. So one example of this is, why would the sight or smell of a bird or a mouse trigger some stalking and killing behavior on part of a cat, even if a cat hasn't seen that before? This wasn't a learned behavior. It seems as though it was innate to the cat. The brain mechanism and the response to the specific stimuli of the bird or the mouse led to this prescribed behavior that was to exist. Notably, though, with these types of experiences, although the IRMs are believed to be pre-wired into the brain, they can be modified with experience. So I think a relevant example to that I have right now is, I just recently got a puppy. And so the puppy, when we take him into the backyard, initially, if there was a rabbit or a squirrel out there, he would want to bolt right after the squirrel or the rabbit. And that's probably part of his pre-wired IRMs, where in the face of this particular prey stimuli, he has this prey drive to go after these animals. Now, what we've been trying to do is, of course, we don't want him to bolt after every single squirrel and rabbit that he sees. So we're rewarding him a lot if we call him back and he'll return to us, rather than running after these other animals. So he's getting better at that as we're practicing it more and more, changing some of the response from these IRMs in his little brain. We can talk about this a little bit more. There was other researchers who had discussed this and described it. So in figure A, we have this Halloween cat that innately stimulates cats' response defensively, like the raised fur, the arched back, the bare teeth, that kind of thing that we'll see that we immediately can recognize in a cat as some of this defensive behavior. And as I said before, this type of behavior, it appears around 6 weeks of age in kittens. So this isn't something that they have seen, likely. And even in the case where the kittens are removed from parent cat, the kittens still will innately respond in this way, even if they've never learned this behavior before. And the belief then is that these mechanisms have been proved to be adaptive evolutionarily, and so then they've been maintained in the species genomes overall. And meanwhile, in image B, we have the Picasso cat, and this does not evoke any type of response at all. The innate trigger is an IRM. More research that was done on this. So this was done by Tiffany Field and colleagues. They had adults display this various exaggerated facial expressions, and the baby responded in very much the same expressions in many of these ways. So they were innately matching the facial expressions to these internal templates that they would have had. Now, the newborns at this point, we know that developmentally they're too young to be able to make these intentional mirroring behaviors with their facial expressions. They just don't have the conscious awareness to realize, oh, this woman right here, she's smiling at me, so I'm going to smile in response. And the smile is, I bring my lips to the side of my face and put the corners up a little bit. The baby isn't thinking it through all of those things. It is just simply mirroring these facial expressions that are shown to them. And again, let's try to think about this evolutionarily. What could be the benefit of matching some of these behaviors? When we play games like the peekaboo with a baby, for example, or other games like that, and we try to be smiling and laughing and get the baby to giggle, when the baby is matching some of those responses, we are finding ourselves drawn more towards the baby in that sense too. And even if it's not the parent, and it's just another baby that we see out in public, we feel the sense of connection in some way to the baby socially. Now, as I talked about before, these IRMs, although we believe they're pre-wired into the brain, experience can modify them. And so there are these spontaneously produced facial expressions that are shown in blind children. And in that case, I think it's just interesting because, of course, children who are born blind, they, even though they've never seen some of these facial expressions displayed in others, they still will create the same facial expressions as sighted people, such as the smiling, surprised face, and whatnot. And similarly, in different cultures, they may emphasize different stimuli as arousing in some of these different ways. Now, these next 2 points are ones we've already covered. Natural selection then is just in favor of some of these behaviors because they've been proved to be adaptive for the organisms. And as a result, then these genes controlling the brain circuits have been passed down to future generations. Now, that leads us to some of the concepts in the field of evolutionary psychology. This field is one that seeks to apply the principles of natural selection to reveal causes of human behavior. And it suggests that behaviors exist because the neural circuits producing them have been favored through natural selection over time. Evolutionary psychologists, people who are filling that role, their job is to generate some intriguing insights and hypotheses about how natural selection might have shaped the brain and behavior. Importantly, however, evolutionary theory cannot account for all human behavior. It doesn't always make sense evolutionarily, and especially I think the more specific we go to an individual's choice for behaviors, it's harder and harder to explain. I think it's the field functions better as it tries to look at broadly what are typical patterns in human behavior that are seen over large groups of people. But even then, we need to be taking into consideration the social context at the time too. That is always going to be changing the cultural context in which some of these behaviors take place as well. We're thinking about some of those environmental influences on behavior. One of the key figures, and this is, I think, on my Mount Rushmore of psychologists, is B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner suggested that learning plays a vital role in behavior, and he suggested that experience shapes behavior by pairing stimuli and reinforcers, so that many complex behaviors are learned, that learning takes place in a brain that has been selected for evolutionary adaptations. Although notably the environment does not always change the brain. So there was the pigeon in a Skinner box that can quickly learn to peck a disc to receive a bit of food, but it cannot learn to do it to escape a mild electric shock to its feet. So it's not always able to, the pigeon that is, not always able to make some of these associations as these associations are not always pre-wired into the brain. And as we're thinking about the learning, there's this learned taste aversion too, which is a nice example of some of the learning in behavior that takes place. So there are these acquired associations between a specific taste or odor and illness. This might have happened where if you ate something recently and very shortly after you ate it, you became sick. Even if the food was well prepared, there was nothing wrong with the food, just the timing of it, it might have created this association in your mind where you have this aversion to the food that you had just had and you don't want to go back and eat it again. And there's some examples that have been studied of this by researchers where there were these coyotes who were killing sheep. And so what the researchers did is they decided to poison these sheep carcasses so that when the coyotes came back to eat the sheep, they became sick. And the coyotes started to associate eating the sheep with becoming sick. And it's also notable that this is evolutionarily the defense mechanism that some animals have. There are many animals that exist where if you end up eating them, you will become sick. And As a result, even though that one organism may die in the process of being eaten, the creature that ate them will then learn to not eat similar creatures in those cases. Then there's also this concept of preparedness. This is a predisposition to respond to certain stimuli differently than other stimuli. The brain is pre-wired to make certain types of associations, but not others, which is, again, I think, just interesting to be thinking about. And this is associated with some of the learning theories. It can be used to help account for some of the complex behaviors, like if there are two rats that are paired in a small box and exposed to a mild electric shock, they'll immediately fight with each other, even though neither was responsible for the shock. So in this case, the rat brain is predisposed to associate injury with nearby objects or other animals in that case, rather than thinking that, oh, this is from an electric shock. That is the end of lecture 1. See you soon for lecture 2.